in your room, you got to stay. Now you feel like the whole world's picking on you, but deep down inside you know it ain't true. You're in punishment cause your mother wants to raise you in the right way, yeah. But you don't care, cause you already made up your mind you wanna run away. You're on your way, runaway child running wild. You better go back home where you belong.
Folks, welcome inside the Parisi Palace, high above 3773's Broadway. This is a live edition of the Jake Feinberg Show, coming on Power Talk. Please go to our website, powertalk.live. Download our free app to your smartphone and stream all of our live local programming, including Solomon on Blast, the Jim Parisi Show, and yours truly, the Jake Feinberg Show. Can't thank you enough for making us part of your day today, and it's a high honor to bring back a friend of the program, a bassist who continues to be fearless on the bandstand, playing his electric apparatus, trying to convince other people to use the electric bass within melodic improvisational settings, and he's just been doing it for so many years, and it's just such a great honor to have him back. Steve Swallow, welcome back to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Thanks for having me, Jake. Glad to be here.
I just wanted, before I forget, I'm going to L.A. and I was talking on the phone with Jim Keltner, the drummer, yesterday, and he said, so I told him I was going to interview you for the second time, and he said, man, he goes, please tell Steve that, because he grew up with Albert Stinson, and Stinson, he said that they didn't know it at the time that Albert was a genius, but he was their leader. I mean, they were jazz snobs, and he said Stinson was in love with Steve Swallow. He wanted me to tell you that. Like they idolized you when they were playing jazz on the West Coast.
Well, it was mutual. I much admired Albert, and more to the point, I really loved his playing. There was something warm and accessible about the way he played that was irresistible. It just drew you in. He was one of my favorite bass players. It was a tragic loss when he died so young.
Did you actually get to see him play? He was really on the West Coast. He was playing with John Handy for a minute. He played with Miles for live once, but he was a brilliant dude. But did you see him play ever?
Yes, I did on a few occasions, and I knew him. He was a friend.
He was a friend. He was a friend.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
We weren't close, but we were close, but we saw each other infrequently. In fact, I last saw him shortly before he died. He died in Boston, and playing with Larry Coryell, if my memory's correct, and a couple of nights before he went to Boston, he came to my apartment and, in fact, borrowed a bass. The bass he was playing on the gig in Boston when he died was one of my basses. That's a dubious.
It's in some ways Albert. I wasn't even conceived or born, but the guy Keltner. Really, Keltner and Bobby Hutcherson were saving his life every night in California because he was so strung out. They'd take him on walks around the block, or and it was tragic. This nexus of genius and addiction. And I wanted you to just step back for a minute. You've worked with you knew Albert, and you worked extensively with Stan Getz, and we're talking about people here that were stone geniuses that, in Stan's case, couldn't even explain where this stuff came from, and they had these incredible addictions as well. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about how you stayed alive, because really, the road can eat you alive. That's hard enough, and trying to be a creative artist is a challenge. But can you talk about how you avoided, if at all, the pitfalls of this of addiction, because it was a big part of the jazz existence.
Yeah, it was, and I'm not sure I can offer any insights into how to survive it. I
How did you survive? How did you? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, it might be largely a matter of luck. I might simply have avoided being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I don't know. I mean, I saw early that I knew several people who were strung out, and I saw the danger of getting strung out, and I saw also the liabilities associated with that life, and I saw, on the other hand, that these guys were really committed to junk. That there was something about it that was really compelling to them, and objectively, kind of weighing the two columns on the page, it just seemed to make sense to me to survive. I had the clear sense that I was a late bloomer as well, that it was going to take me a long time to get good at what I was doing.
I love it.
And that the likelihood is I would be cutting my life short if I committed to that addiction. But I think it would be kind of fatuous to claim that I made a strong decision not to become addicted. I just kind of lucked out. I managed to avoid it, or it managed to avoid me. Hard to say. I'm extremely grateful that I didn't succumb to addiction, because as you say, it was around. The generation before mine, the guys who were 10 years older than I was, who were born, say, in 1930 or thereabouts, that generation was just decimated by heroin. My generation began to pull back from it, and I think it's become increasingly less prevalent in the music community as it's become more prevalent in society in general. So
that's an incredible statement to make, because we have this crisis that in some ways has been brought on by big pharmaceutical companies, and people are able to make their own cocktails now. Did you get the sense? I remember talking to this mercurial guitarist from the West Coast, and he was like, people that understand that the music is coming through them, they keep their ego, they're humbled, because they realize they don't have any control of the music they're making. And if they reach a certain level of success, or what, relatively speaking, in this society, they're okay. They have peace of mind because they understand it's really not. The music's coming. It's coming through them, as opposed to people who struggle with that concept, and because they want to believe through their ego that they're creating this music, and that they have no real way. They can't accept the fact that they don't have any control over it. And so I mean, there's this sort of. There's two ways to create art, and I just wonder if you felt like there were people that struggled with addiction because they couldn't explain their genius. They had people coming up to them and telling them they were gods, or they were being worshipped, and at the same time they didn't have any idea how they were able to do it.
I don't know, Jake. I think you're right. I mean, I think it's undoubtedly a difficult thing to preserve your talent. I mean, it's something that requires a kind of sense of daily vigilance, and there are all kinds of ways you can screw up. You can screw up simply by not practicing enough, or you can screw up by messing up your life to the point where you can't play well. A lucky few managed to skate through. I do think there may be some kind of trade-off involved. I do think there are some people I've known who've kind of knowingly foreshortened their life, and lived kind of hard and brilliantly. At least in part because they felt they were being true to their gift. That their best course was to get everything out they could in a limited period of time. And then there are people like me who feel that the long haul is the best thing that can be done on behalf of our talent, and that's been the case for me, and I think that may help to explain why I've managed to remain more or less upright and walking a
well, I mean, I hope you live another 100 years, man. I mean, is there anybody that you can point to specifically that when you say they were being true to their art and going hard, is there somebody you can point to specifically that stayed true to themselves that way?
Well, on the electric bass, the guy who springs to mind is Jocko, who burned very brightly, but for not too long. But immediately you run into the question of whether Jocko was making conscious decisions to burn the candle brightly. I think he was in the grips of whatever demons there were that drove him to excess and to a short but brilliant life.
What about I'm curious about I'm curious about the generation before you that was decimated. Who are we talking about there? Those cats. Well,
there are a lot of really obscure guys who were kind of haunting the session scene in New York when
this is right up Jake Feinberg's alley,
It was and there were a bunch of very nice, sort of tragic, forlorn guys who played brilliantly but were unable to get to the gig on time. Sonny Clark was around when I first came to New York, and his touch on the piano would just melt your heart in an instant. He was a magnificent player, and absolutely incapable of ordering his life to the extent that you could say, "Sonny, I've got a gig for you. You have to be at the,
right
at Birdland at Tuesday at 9:00 at night." It was just absurd to think that he would that he would make that. But he'd show up at the session places, the lofts that were open for playing any time at that in those days, and sit down and play brilliantly for a couple of hours, and then wander away. There were all kinds of legendary guys. Freddie Greenwell, the tenor player.
Freddie Greenwell. This is unbelievable. This is so important. I mean, first of all, I just went out to. I've been taking my show on the road and doing a lot of video, Facebook Live video, and I had this little pocket of time in Oakland a couple weeks ago, and I called up none other than Gildo Mahones. Did you ever?
Oh, wow!
And here he is, this beautiful cat who I interviewed 2 years ago. I walk in, his wife says, he just got out of the hospital. I don't know what he's going to be able to do. Or, and I walk in, and I just went up to him. I said, "Gildo, I just want to say this is a really divine thing. It's such an honor to see you." He's, he has a walker. He sits down at the acoustic piano, and we go live. And he has no vision in one eye anymore, and he's just playing the piano just the way you're talking about. This most just succulent, all by feel. just all by feel and it wasn't perfect, but we had a ball for 40 minutes. There's just something about those old school cats and their ability to tell a story. I know they probably couldn't keep their lives in order. They couldn't necessarily get to the gigs on time, but man,
Yeah,
I don't know. So you're the loft scene. Okay, because I'm like in the loft scene where Dave Liebman is playing the drums like Elvin,
Right.
and Brecker's got, and so that's later. You're talking about a loft scene that preceded that.
I am, but it preceded it by only 7 or 8 years.
Well,
that's a lot. Yeah, I'm talking about the loft scene that was kind of centered around 6th Avenue in the 20s, which is also where Liebman had a notorious session loft in the late 1960s. But I'm talking about the early 1960s when Eugene Smith's loft was a kind of focal point for jam sessions, and this was a building where Hall Overton, the composer, also had a floor, and the rehearsals for the Thelonious Monk Big Band, Carnegie Hall, Town Hall Band were held, and there were sessions going on all the time, all day and all night, in this loft, and on a few other lofts up and down 6th Avenue at that time. Ronnie Free, the drummer, was a denizen, and at one time the nominal renter of the loft that was ground zero for sessions, and where I played with Sonny Clark on several occasions. It was a wonderful, vital scene. It was the flour district. It was where wholesale flour companies had their shops, and at 7 o'clock in the morning, trucks would arrive from the countryside and dump off tons and tons of fresh flowers, and this wonderful scent would rise up to the lofts, and we'd be at that point just about finishing up,
right,
for the night. And life kind of began around 5 o'clock when this part of Manhattan would fall silent, when the businesses who were there would close up, and the people would go home, and all of a sudden another New York would rise up, and it was those of us who stayed up all night learning how to play music. It was a wonderful kind of enchanted environment around the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan at that time.
I was going to ask you, what do you said you were learning to play music. You were already playing with, just correct me if was it John Lee Hooker in the ghettos of New Haven? Who were you?
No, I never played John Lee Hooker, but I was playing in the considerable black neighborhood in.
But there was one cat you told me about in the first interview that you.
It's probably Vernon Biddle, the keyboard player, piano organ player. He was tremendously important to me, and he's at best a footnote in the jazz history books. He played with Howard McGee for a while, and he was kind of part of the bebop community in New York briefly in the 40s, and then I think retreated to New Haven in order to maintain a semblance of sanity and normalcy. There was also another piano player named Count Steadwell, who worked for the post office, but played every night somewhere in a club in New Haven, and there were dozens of bars that had at least a trio.
No, this is what it was. It was T-Bone Walker and Buddy Guy.
I did play with those guys, not in New Haven, but on tours, and that would have been in the I don't know, 63, 64, about the time I was playing with Art Farmer. Maybe
I cannot believe
later.
this. You were on the Chitlin circuit with T-Bone Walker?
Well, it wasn't the Chitlin circuit. They had been kind of plucked out of the Chitlin circuit. In fact, the tours that I did with them were organized by George Wein. It was kind of the early days of George Wein's
so cool.
empire. He was in the process of building a concert empire at that time, and had always kind of diversified beyond what was strictly jazz music to try to include blues and related musics.
I was going to say, I mean, so basically, those were gigs that you might wind up at, like, a Newport Jazz Festival, but T-Bone Walker would be playing at those festivals? Yeah,
that kind of thing, and European tours as well, and tours throughout the States. This would throughout the '60s. There was still a market for jazz that has kind of shrunk persistently since. My theory is that it's a kind of inhalation-exhalation thing, and that we're due for an exhale any day now.
Well, we can get into that. We got an short audio clip here. I want you to take a listen to this. It's kind of profound, and you led into it beautifully with the floral parades that would take place in the early morning hours of New York. So take a listen to this, and we'll come back and talk about it.
Okay.
That was a yearly thing that the Scholastic magazine did, picking the 4 of the best rock lyrics, and I got in on it with Steve Swallow. He was the producer.
Wow.
And he asked me to sing, and so I sang 4 tunes. And the following year, he bowed out, and I became the producer. And, of course, I kept being the singer, too. But I would make the arrangements and book the band. And it was basically jazz men playing pop music or rock and roll music, the best.
You have any idea who that is?
Yeah, that'd be Bob Duro.
That'd be the man. And again, here we have Steve Swallow marinating in this vortex of all music. It's all music. And we let we led into the show with the 44th Street Portable Flower Factory, Runaway Child, Running Wild, Swallow on bass. I'm sure you were. I'm not sure if you picked up on that when you heard it, but I mean, I love. This is the exhalation that this society needs, and unfortunately, the recording scene doesn't allow for that. But can you talk about this portable flower? How Scholastic got a hold of you? And how this worked? I mean, this is the greatest thing these albums. I've never seen any of these albums, but there's a lot of stuff on YouTube, and the songs are great.
Yeah, they are. I love that project, and again, it was just kind of serendipity and coincidence and all that. I was living at the time. This would have been the mid '60s, early '60s, I guess. In New York City on 19th Street and 9th Avenue, a neighborhood that I could never afford to live in now.
No.
And my landlady was a woman named Betty Owen who worked in the upper echelons of Scholastic magazine, and she was a lovely person who was interested in my life as a musician and in the music that I was playing, and concocted the idea of this project and this recording, and the idea was for Scholastic to sell it through its well-established channels as a teaching aid to junior high school teachers to push the idea that rock and roll, and in particular the lyrics of rock and roll tunes, had value as poetry and were worthy of a place in the school curriculum. So she left the project entirely to me. She just told me to do 4 or 5 3 or 4 minute tunes with whomever I wanted covering, and we kind of talked about what the one you picked was
Temptations.
Runaway Child, and we also did a Donovan tune and a Beatles tune, and I forget what else, but it was a
James Taylor. The Donovan tune is totally tripped out. Not everything is available online. I just want to find the vinyl on. So go back to this for a minute. There was a part of it was rock and roll. People were saying, "Oh, they were like these are terrible. These are." Because, you talk about the blues coming out of the church, and people were like, we don't... Sometimes the church rejected that. They didn't want to necessarily see that. But go back to this thing where they said... you're talking about... You did a bunch of Beatles stuff. You did the Temptation stuff. And there was this... So that there was this idea that there's validity in poetry and rock lyrics. Can you go a little bit deeper on that?
Well, that was Betty's... thesis, and that was what she wanted to affirm in making this recording, and of course she was right. There were some extraordinary writers within that community. Smokey Robinson springs immediately to mind. He was a great lyricist. And of course, to kind of stretch a point, they were in the long line of Tin Pan Alley lyricists who were absolutely brilliant. Cole Porter,
absolutely,
and all of those guys. So it's nothing new that popular music contains real art. And anybody who, with any degree of openness, has got to concede that that's the case. Here's an interesting sidebar to all of this.
Yeah.
Was that Betty, a wonderful woman with a kind of insatiable curiosity, was also fascinated by Carla Bley, to whom I introduced her. And Carla produced a similar album that was distributed through the same channels as the one I did with Bob Duro.
What was it called?
It was called a Wreath of Carols, and it was a collection of Christmas carols arranged by Carla. And I played bass and sang on it, and she had several others that I don't even remember who, but just people we knew who sang Christmas carols in 4-part harmony, and that was it.
Well, hold on, I just want to be clear. This is so amazing. Your landlady was somehow affiliated with Scholastic? I'm just curious how it...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, she was an executive at Scholastic with some power, the sufficient power to push through these eccentric projects.
Mr. Swallow, I wanted to ask you, I want to read you this quote from Don Randy. I'm not sure if you've ever hung out with Don, part of the Wrecking Crew. He was doing
Yeah, I never hung out with him, but I know well who he is. Yeah.
I want you to just step back for a minute and think about this in this context of the creative alacrity and control that you had as a musician. Like 44th Street Portable Flower Factory, you turn on the back of the album, all the credits are there, okay? But beyond that, also the idea of everybody being in one place doing it. I want to read you this quote because I just transcribed it. He said, I still get called to do sessions today. Although it's so impersonal, when you do them today, you go in and nobody's there. It's you and the producer and the engineer. You put your part down and you go home. There's no other musicians. Usually it's an overdub part. It's not the way it was done. It's completely different than what was done before. They're in the booth, you're in the studio, and you're playing an electric keyboard or an electric synth, and it's going directly into the booth back and forth. There's no bass player, there's no drum. You're listening to a track, and that's it. It's very formal. And you talk about waiting for that exhale. When you get called, is that similar to you? And how... I guess more to the point, when you were doing sessions, any of them, for that period of magical time when the blues and the jazz barely had any separation, how much control did the musicians have in dictating how the music was supposed to feel, and the producers and the engineers just did their jobs as opposed to doing stuff that they knew nothing about?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a question worth asking a number of people, because I think you'd get a number of answers. My personal history was that my experience in the recording studio, starting in 1960 when I began making records, through the first close to 10 years of my experience in the studio, was that kind of ideal heaven you described, where there was a producer and an engineer there to serve the music, and their job, as they saw it and as we saw it, as we the musicians saw it as well, was just to facilitate getting the music onto tape. All of the early stuff that I recall doing was done in that pretty much in that manner. I kind of, for me, there was a kind of turning point, and it happened on a Gary Burton date. We were all of a sudden assigned a guy who was already a famous producer, Joel Dorn.
Sure.
His name was.
Sure.
Produced a lot of great records.
Yeah, a lot of Aretha stuff. Yeah, a lot of stuff for Atlantic and stuff.
Yeah, a lot of Aretha stuff. Yeah. And all of a sudden, on this Gary Burton date, I was being told what to play.
Wow.
And I was shocked and
Wow.
offended, and the date went badly, and I got surly. But
I want to see that. I want to see that.
It was interesting. In retrospect, that was kind of the writing on the wall, because as the role of the producer evolved, he became a kind of a member of the corporate team at the record company. In the case of Joel Dorn, it was Atlantic, and he felt responsible not to the music so much as to the corporations, and the corporation, in this case, Nestle and Ahmet Erdogan. And his job, as he saw it, was to deliver to the company a saleable product, and that was I think in a way that this impulse, this kind of perspective on producing records, came from the pop music industry. Atlantic was already involved in producing mega hits with a lot of rock and roll bands and rhythm and blues bands as well. And I think somebody up there at the top of the company, probably Ahmet himself, noticed that jazz music was not as nearly as profitable as these other musics, and felt that was why he had Atlantic Records. It was to make money, and communicated this to the down
the chain of command.
Chain,
yes.
Until it got to Joel Dorn, and Joel saw his job as to make records that were playable on the radio, attractive to the what was left of the jazz DJ community.
Right. No, I want to go back to something.
And so on down the line.
This is so. Was it a, like, when he? Well, first of all, did Gary, as the leader, would object to somebody? I mean, what was the recommendation he was making to you? Was it a conceptual thing? Was it like what did he mean? He was telling you what to play.
I remember Arif Martin was also around.
Sure.
Although Joel was listed as the producer. This was a record, I think, that was made in 1969 with the Gary Burton.
Yeah, Good
Quartet.
Vibes, I bet, right? Good Vibes.
It was somewhere, one of those. Yeah, it could have been that one, in fact. And Gary was very much caught in the middle, because I was being told that Arif Martin was actually coming out and singing specific bass figures he wanted me to play. And in fact, he wanted me to play them on a song I had written. So he was effectively doing, I suppose, what he did on Arif sessions, which was to go out there and hum parts to the guys and then and produce a hit, and poor Gary was kind of stuck between my offense and my distaste for what was going on, and his desire to maintain a position at Atlantic Records, to keep his contract with Atlantic Records alive.
Sure.
He was looking to see what he could possibly do to satisfy Joel Dorn and Arif Martin on the one hand, and to play the music that we had put together without their help on the other hand. And everybody reaches his or her own position in that spectrum.
It's amazing to have that brazenness. I just would not have the balls to be able to go to Steve Swallow on a song that you wrote and be like, yo, we're going to make this more of a radio-friendly tune. I want the bass line to go like this or so. I don't... That was not existent with... Like, okay, going back to Sonny Clark or Art Farmer, or these masters of the music that you learned from and were in the studio with. So they had full creative control. I mean, I remember Kenny Barron, Yusuf Lateef invited him to write a couple of tunes for a new album. He wasn't playing on it. He walked in. It was the first time in New York, and Richard Davis was there, and Yusuf, and just a bunch of guys, and they were dictating, because there was like one or two microphones, there just wasn't a lot of amplification. Right. And so like they were like, yo, we're gonna play this a little bit over here and do the, and then whatever, it was all suggestions from the musicians. Whether or not they got credits on the back of the album was irrelevant. The music was being created by the cats. So what was that feeling? That must have been unbelievable. When was that? Do you remember a seminal session or in the early 60s where you played a real, maybe you had your first real role as sort of coordinating some piece of music when the artist had full control of that?
Well, I think probably accurately, there wasn't in my career in the studio, at least, a point at which everything changed, and before that point the artists were completely in control of their product, and after that the producers were completely in control. It was a kind of subtle shading going on, and always the first recording I made, which happened a few months after I arrived in New York, was a Jimmy Giuffre trio recording with Paul Bley and Jimmy Giuffre.
So beautiful.
And it was for Verve Records. Jimmy had a multi-album contract with Verve, and had given them over a period of a few years some recordings that were successful for them, the Train in the River, all that kind of stuff. His trios had produced a kind of amiable, folksy music that Verve was happy to record and distribute. The trio with Jim Hall and Ralph Pena and all, which I loved dearly. It was some wonderful music. But then Jimmy had a kind of road to Damascus experience, heard Ornette, and all of a sudden started playing free.
I love it. I love it.
Hired Paul Bley to abet him in this process, and Paul brought me into the band. So we showed up at a New York recording studio for the new Jimmy Jufrey Trio recording, playing free music. Creed Taylor was the Creed Taylor.
Well, no, I've interviewed Creed like 4 times. I love the dude is. I mean, I got it. Let's listen to one of these tunes off this album so the audience can get an idea of the road to Damascus for Jufrey here.
Okay,
we'll come back and talk. Here we go.
Okay.
I mean, I could listen to this for days, man. Weird. That tune was called Weird. WHIRR. And the picture on YouTube, Jufrey playing Swallow. You are bent over the electric bass, head down. Can't even see your face. Plucking the notes. And then there's, I guess, Paul going inside the piano to do something with this. I'm not sure. I mean, this was this revolutionary for the time?
It might not have been revolutionary, but it was it was something close to revolutionary. And the irony is that it sounds amiable now. It's no longer threatening, at least to me. It's just 3 guys trying to play some music, groping toward consonants and all of that. I have the same impression of Ornette's music when I first heard Ornette at the 5 spot. It it was a shock. It was a physical shock. I was reeling from what he was doing. And when I returned to the music he made at that time, now it's just warm and welcoming, inviting, and not in the least an assault. And I recognize too that at the time Ornette didn't perceive it that way. He was just playing the music that he loved to play. There was not the intention to turn the world on its head. The world got turned on its head as a sort of a byproduct of what they were doing.
Absolutely, man. No, I mean, this is the same. Going back to Emphasis, this is Emphasis in Flight, 1961. Jufrey called you, then you recruited Paul, and you got, and then
Jufrey called Paul, and then Paul recruited me.
Paul recruited you. So, this is where the rubber meets the road, because you guys were doing this to find new ground, to search for new ground in music, not the way my generation and my daughter's generations are growing up with in this sort of culture now, or civilization, I don't know what you would call it, fully interconnected, where it's about, I want to be famous, or I want to make a lot of money. I mean, that to me this was the last thing that you guys were concerned about. I mean, you walked away with a little bit of money in your pocket because of the session, but this was really about expanding musical vocabulary, and there's no drummer.
No, there's
no drummer anywhere to be found. I mean, to me, can you just talk to cats out there about how you learned, and maybe it was in these W. Eugene Smith loft sessions where you learned to play melodically without having to rely on a trap set?
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the Gene Smith loft sessions, because that goes a long way to explaining that the modus operandi for the sessions at that loft and the other several lofts near it that also hosted sessions, where you just started playing with whatever configuration was available.
Right.
And there may or may not have been drums. There may have been two saxophones and piano and bass. There may have been trumpet and bass, and that's it. There may have been, in my case, there was always a bass, but it might have been drums and piano, and that's it, and so on. It was kind of born of circumstance, of who was there, what kind of music evolved, and it became clear to me and to many other people in the early 1960s that it was useful and stimulating to dispense with playing the standard chord progressions that Charlie Parker never rejected.
Absolutely.
That generation never rejected it. It just happened in the history of jazz music that in about 1960, the late 1950s, it occurred to several people that it was valuable to explore music without predetermined chord sequences and without predetermined rhythmic fields as well. And it was immensely exciting and productive because the idea was so new, because it had such force to it, because it was a breathtakingly original and earth-shaking idea. Of course, now 40 or 50 years down the road,
right.
It's not so astonishing to say, okay, let's play a free tune. everybody's kind of developed a free vocabulary, and if you say, okay, let's play a free tune, everybody just plays a free tune without hesitation. That's inevitable. I think that's how the history of music goes. Shortly after Bach, there were generations of musicians, including his own kids, who could do that.
Right.
And so on. Schoenberg gave birth to a few generations of people who ran with the 12-tone system and achieved some remarkable results. And that's just how history goes. I feel very fortunate to have been kind of at the cresting of that wave, because it's particularly exciting to be there when it's first happening.
Yeah, that is. I think that's the thing. Is like it really wasn't happening before that, right? I mean, this was the beginning. Other cats were Ornette, like you said. It was just sort of in the air, in the water. But at that beginning time, it's just so, just. I mean, but in general, though, you, going back to Sonny Clark, I mean, he wouldn't get to the gig on, you couldn't get him to the gigs on time per se, but you just would go in, there was no, these Eugene Smith loft sessions. I mean, you just had to do with whatever was there. You had to rely on what was ever there. And if there was no trap drummer, then you just had to you had to keep time in your own sort of free way. I just find it to be, to me, it's like today, what I love about the early free music, I think also is like, I don't hear anybody trying to demonstrate huge facility. I hear a lot of searching. I hear a lot of experimentation. Today, I don't know. I mean, we just lost the great drummer Ndugu Chancellor, another drummer was telling me a story about going to some sort of drum clinic, and there was this incredibly young drummer, very just monster technique, and just soloing like crazy for 20 minutes. I think he stopped and wiped his brow and then continued on for another 20. And this drummer who I was talking to looked over at Ndugu, and Ndugu was snoring. He was passed out. It was just so it's like the lack of feel. It's the feel. The feel was so good. Like it didn't even strike me as like it just that it was a magic. And I wonder at that time, being that you were not ensconced in junk and that you weren't heavily addicted or being, because I mean Stan Getz, that was his number one priority, was making sure that he had junk. I mean, that was Scotty LaFaro in some ways. They were all hooked on it. But the fact is, did you have a chance to stop and really smell the roses at that time to say, wow, this is, I find with my life sometimes I could do these epic interviews and then I'm ready to move on to the next thing. And it's like, is it only in hindsight, or do you remember it that even in that decade saying, wow, I got to just stop and enjoy this for a minute?
Yeah, there were moments when I reflected on what we were doing. When Paul Bley and I, in fact, reflected on what we were doing, and it occurred to us that it was singular. That it might have lasting value, and that we should take what we were doing seriously. I mean, I think it was useful and maybe even necessary for us to kind of step back and to declare to ourselves that what we were doing had some value. It was necessary to do that in part because there weren't many other people saying so. We had to kind of affirm to ourselves that what we were doing was significant, and in order to justify to ourselves to continue continue on with it. But we did have a kind of obstinate belief that what we were doing was important and would be, validated by history and all of that stuff. And of course you have grandiose hopes for what you do that exceed reality. And in fact, the Giuffre Trio disbanded for lack of work. We were working in a coffee house on Bleecker Street. We were able to go to Europe and make some decent bread once every couple of years.
Right.
But then when we returned to the United States, the only gigs available to us were, it came down to, at least in our last days, gigs for the door in coffee houses on Bleecker Street in Greenwich Village. And I remember vividly the last night of that trio, we played in the coffee house, and we each made 35 cents.
I'll tell you, man.
Which, of course, was 35 cents was a lot more then than it is now. It was
a couple of Cokes and a loaf of bread, man. I mean, that sounds great.
Yeah. And, but we kind of met at the end of the night and said, okay, this is not viable. We're going to have to, each of us is going to have to find a way to make a living, and we'll disband, at least for now. And we did, in fact, disband until the 1990s, so there was about a 30-year hiatus, and then we returned and did 2 or 3 European tours for decent bread in the 90s, sort of at the very end of Jimmy's career as a player.
Yeah, I'm just looking here. So we heard that 61, and then there was a couple, looks like the other things from Stuttgart and Bremen that got released in the 90s. There was this Flight from 61, Emphasis, and then also Free Fall on Columbia from 62. So the point is you were able to create a footprint in that limited time.
Luckily there were some radio recordings from Europe that were quite good, I think, that have come out, and there were 2 albums released by Verve Records, and the one you just mentioned by Columbia, which is my favorite, actually, the one called Free Fall.
I'm going to be looking for that everywhere now.
So there was kind of a footprint, and then we made a few albums in the 90s as well for small European labels, and they're interesting too by way of contrast or to sort of chart the evolution.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'm not seeing that on the discography here, but there's also, you continued to collaborate with Bley. You had Footloose in 63, Closer 66, and then something from the mid 80s. But just we're cooking through set 2 here. I wanted to, but before we wrap this up, set 2, I needed to ask you about this mercurial poet, because I was interviewing Charles McPherson 5 years ago, and I was just transcribing the interview, and he was talking about the relationship that Mingus had with a guy named Kenneth Patchen.
Yeah.
Did you know?
Yep.
Did those kinds of guys show? Did you play with him? And were there? Because he was pre-beats. He wasn't even a beat poet. He was earlier than that. And
right, he was a kind of proto-beat, I guess.
Proto-beat. Yeah. We're looking for that word. Is that? We got to find a word for that. But did you? Because Mingus did a benefit concert with the band with Duffy for him when he got sick, and I have this album with Alan Ferguson and Patchen that's just unbelievable. He was playing with chamber jazz ensembles. But would those proto-beats or even the beats show up at Eugene Smith's studio ever and do poetry while you guys were playing?
Very occasionally.
Very rare.
But it happened, yeah. And there was in New York City at that time there was a flow between the arts. I remember going to Franz Klein's studio one day and seeing these huge and immediately compelling paintings stacked up, everywhere. The paintings that are now worth millions of dollars, and
Wow.
and
Wow.
you know, and when I came to New York, I knew about the Cedar Bar. I knew where the artists lived. I knew where the literary guys hung out, and I was interested in all of that. And I was not alone. There was an interchange going on. One of the gigs I had in the early '60s was at another coffee house on Bleecker Street, which was that's a chapter worthy of consideration all on its.
Well, no, let's just,
own.
okay, so let's just, I don't even want to, listen, let's just, this is set to, we're done. We have more ground to cover. Let's just let it breathe for a minute, and then we'll, if we could reconvene, it would be wonderful to do set 3.
That sounds like a good idea. In fact, I got to go pick up a car.
Go pick up a car. Yeah, well, no, I mean, I'm going to Mill Valley to celebrate my 40th birthday. I'm going to be in wine country doing on the road journalism. But when I get back, when are you out of the country? Are you here in March, or where are you at?
I'm in and out. So when you get back from Mill Valley, we'll see if we can find a time.
Yeah, let's pick up where this chapter here in the coffee houses with the poets. But Steve Swallow, always inspiring, and thank you for shining a big bright light in a very eloquent way on our cultural history, man. I absolutely, these types of interviews are the ones that I actually do stop and smell the roses. So thank you, brother.
Yeah, well, thanks for what you're doing to annotate and preserve this culture. I think it's valuable, and
it's about promotion, man. It's about promotion. It's not about preservation. It's about younger cats can understand how to exhale. I mean, ultimately, how real music is made. You know. So, and thank you. You're a vital cog. So we'll continue on.
Okay, sounds good.
Later
Thanks,
on, man.
Jay.
All right.
Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Steve Swallow, part 2 in the books. And we'll be back with Alex Blake right after this.